Ian Murray, a lot of politics at this conference, but where's the policy? Where's the beef?
Well, I think you've seen a lot of policy with Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor's speech earlier, really laying out how we get the economy motoring so we can reinvest in public services, and of course the strapline being let's get Britain's future back, which I think is the really essence of this conference and the essence of her speech.
But very light on the specifics, even when she was talking about the minimum wage and basically all that's going to change is that the Low Pay Commission will be forced to take into account the cost of living situation. That's not much of a change, is it?
Let me give you other examples of scrapping 0 hours contracts, outlawing fire and rehire, putting in a proper day's pay for a proper day's work. All of those things are huge, big policy
All of those things we've heard umpteen times from your
50,000
party
jobs
before.
with GB Energy, going after the people who frauded the country with COVID. All of these things are about stability in the economy, making sure the markets have that stability so you can grow the economy, create the jobs, create the wealth, invest them in public services and renew the country.
In your speech you talked about making the Scotland office Scotland's voice in Westminster and working with the Scottish Government. How are you going to do that, and what are you doing now to set the groundwork for that?
Well, look, 70% of the Scottish public want just both governments to work together, and what we really need to do in the benefit of Scotland and Scottish people, at least up until 2026 while the SNP are in power at Holyrood, is to try and find ways to work together. Now, I understand it takes two to tango. I'm willing to tango. If they don't want to dance, then that's absolutely fine, but we've got to try and get two governments to work together, and my commitment as the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, if we become the Secretary of State for Scotland, is to make sure we can find ways of working together.
Sounds like Labour love bombing.
Well, it's not love bombing at all, it's practicalities. I mean, we can't go on like this. We've got two dysfunctional governments in Scotland, the Tories at Westminster and the SNP at Holyrood.
It's certainly a dysfunctional relationship.
Well, it's a dysfunctional relationship at the moment, isn't it? And they're both mutually trying to make it a dysfunctional relationship. So we've got to make that better. But I also talked in my speech about making the Scotland office Scotland's window to the world and making sure it can be the delivery unit for the UK government in Scotland.
What about the Internal Market Act? Are you in favour of that? You were against it in Westminster when it went through.
Well, we're against the principles of it, but we'll have to see what has to replace it if it needs to be replaced at all. We can only do that when we're in government, of course, and see what the mechanisms are. A lot of the discussion we're having at the moment, of course, we'll have to wait till we get closer to government because we've no idea what the state of the economy will be in, and I suspect it may be a lot worse then than it is today.
Would you be willing to consider reversing some of the tough decisions that Alistair Jack has taken against the Scottish Parliament? GRR, DRS, would you be willing to change them?
We've made it pretty clear that we agree with Section 35. It's a mechanism that was designed by Donald Dewar to make it work in terms of devolution, but the key thing about that is it should be...
Are you just saying that Alistair Jack was right to block GRR in the way that he did?
No, because what should have happened was that all of those should have been ironed out before. The reason Section 35 has never been used before is because both governments are supposed to work together to resolve those issues.
So is he right to have done that? Are you saying he's right to have done that?
Well, the courts will now decide, but he's right to use Section 35 if he needs to use it, but the courts will decide whether or not that was a reasonable thing for him to do. Actually, when you look at what...
But do you think it was a reasonable thing for him to do?
Well, I actually think the results that he's put forward in terms of the legal agreement is pretty thin, but the courts will decide.
What about the deposit return scheme? Is that something that Labour will revisit?
Well, it's a shambles, isn't it? The whole deposit return scheme is a shambles, so it is something we're going to have to revisit. DEFRA are doing the English scheme at the moment that would become the UK-wide scheme, and that's what the current Secretary of State is trying to promote. But whilst DRS is a complete mess in Scotland, you're going to have to pause that, unwind it and try and do something different.
The STUC and Unite want you to devolve employment laws, will you?
That's not part of the policy at the moment to devolve employment law, but our new deal for working people is for the whole of the UK, and it would be the biggest change in rights for working people this country's seen in 100 years. Anas
Sarwar talked before his speech today at a fringe meeting. He was talking about joint meetings between UK Labour and Scottish Labour, about things like the manifesto, about the first 100 days in government. What extent is there consultation between Scottish and UK Labour there? How involved is Scottish Labour in that?
Well, it's a fundamental partnership because, yes, we'll have our own Scottish manifesto for the UK elections, as we've always had, because, of course, a lot of the big issues are devolved and the Scottish people will want to see a Scottish response to that, but there's also huge involvement in things like GB Energy, the publicly owned energy company that will be headquartered in Scotland. All those things happen through discussion and through making sure that both of the elements of the party can work together.
Are you getting anything out of it?
Oh, well, we've just got 50,000 jobs in terms of the headquarters of GB Energy in Scotland. That's huge already. That's just the starting point. But it'll be my job as Secretary of State, if I'm lucky enough to be elected, to make sure we can implement that properly and Scotland gets its share.
Ian Murray, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.
My pleasure.